Good evening. Welcome to tonight's shir. We are Thursday of Parshas Emoyer, and so we'll go straight into our questions. The first one is about candlesticks, and we have described this situation. You have your candlesticks at your table from the beginning of Shabbos, and you also have the chalas at the table. Now, generally, we have the idea of what's called bosis l'dover ha'osur. If a surface is dedicated only for a muksa item, that makes the surface muksa. So if you've got a little table where you have a telephone, so not only is the telephone muksa, but the table is also muksa. And if even after the telephone, let's say, has come off the table, that table remains muksa for the rest of Shabbos, that's the concept of bosis l'dover ha'osur. But then we have what's called bosis l'dover ha'osur umuta, where the surface is holding muksa and non-muksa items, and so the presence of the dover hamuta kind of balances out, and now the table doesn't become muksa. Very well. Okay. So then there is a caveat to that the counterbalance to unmuksify the table has to be of greater value or greater importance than the muksa. So again, you have a table and it's got a muksa item, and you want to prevent the table from becoming muksa, so you put a non-muksa item. That other item has to be of a similar and I think slightly greater value. So traditionally, you had your chalice at the table, and you have your candles at the table, your candlesticks, or oil lamp. An oil lamp, how much did it cost already? And then what would you have now to have to balance? Okay, so there's the lamps which provide light, and then you've got the challahs which provide food. And you ask a simple question: what would you prefer? To sit in light and be hungry, or to sit in the dark and have a sandwich? So most of us would say, give me the sandwich, I'll cope with the dark. I'll prefer to eat in the dark than to be hungry in the light. I can understand. So the challahs are more important than the candles. Therefore, the challahs outweigh the candles and candlesticks. Now, then just one more detail in this. If you know, in Hilchas Muksa, there's different levels of Muksa. There's called Muksa Gomer and Muksa She'ena Gomer. And Muksa She'ena Gomer is the kind of article which you are allowed to move if you needed the space or if you wanted to improvise with it. So a hammer is a tool, and if you wanted to use the hammer to keep a door open as a weight, you are allowed to. It's called the Tzorech Gufer Mekoymer, and so on. So that's not a Muksa Gomer. What is a Muksa Gomer? An article which is, let's say, paint, sand, stones. They are not kalim, they're not equipment, they are materials which cannot be processed on Shabbos. So sand cannot be processed on Shabbos, so that's called muksa machmas gufoy, and that's the stronger muksa. But you're not allowed to move l'tzorech gufoy mekayimai. I could just do one short illustration. If you open my larder, you may see a jar of beans. Now those beans are hard and they are inedible. They can only be processed by cooking, which is not on Shabbos. So that jar of beans is muksa machmas gufay. Behind the jar of beans, there is a box of chocolate. I'm not allowed to move the jar of beans to get to the chocolate behind it, because the jar of beans is muksa gomer, muksa machmas gufay, muksa gomer, and I'm not allowed to move it even to gufay mekayim. So coming now, but kalim, yes. Kalim shemlachtel is I'm allowed to move the gufay mekayim. So now, going back to the candlesticks, regular candlesticks, cheap candlesticks, would you use them for anything else? Possibly. You know, you've got these glass short, stubby candlesticks. Some people use them for a salt cellar. So, earlier times, perhaps they used those kind of candlesticks to store some coins. Yet such a candlestick you use for other stuff. So it's a cliche malachtelis. Therefore, it's not such a strong muksa. You didn't need to even counterbalance. Possibly you didn't even need to have a counterbalance to that. Only to the flame. What we have now, though, is a situation. We've got these silver candlesticks, most in many, Kamina Hanagidim Hamforsomim, and they cost $1,000, whatever. And so you would never use them for anything else. So the argument is then, and then I put to my class in the Babbage Girls' School. What would you prefer? To have your sandwich, to have, if I offer you, I can give you a sandwich, or if I give you $1,000, you go hungry for an evening. So I would say, I'll go hungry for an evening. I'll miss an evening supper for $1,000. So therefore, what's more important, the candlesticks or the challahs? Can you say that the challahs are more important than $1,000? For most of us, that's not necessarily the case. So here's the problem. Do the challahs outbalance the value of these silver candlesticks? All right. So here, this question was addressed by the Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. We have it in the Shmiras Shabbos Kehilchoso. He talks about the candlesticks at the table. That if it's just the candlesticks, then the table becomes muksa. But if there was a chalas at the table, it's not muksa. Now, then he says in his note, it makes sense to me that the chalas outweigh the candlesticks. That's only with simple candlesticks, and they are bottled to the flame. But if you've got these silver candlesticks, as is common today, and people, this is a dover choshev, and people don't just leave them lying around, they put them in a special place. So he considers them muksa machmas chasanikis. Muksa because of the value, muksa of something which you'd never improvise with. You'd never use your silver candlesticks even as a shaitel head, even as a hat stand. Ashra candlesticks, yeah. So then that's muksa machmas chasanikis. Muksa, a valuable thing which you wouldn't improvise, is on the level of muksa gomur or muksa machmas gufay. You're not allowed to move it l'sech gufay mekoymai. Well, that makes it, then you have to outbalance the value of those candlesticks, which is a big deal. And therefore, yeah. So now this is his initial approach. However, he says, I heard from Shlomo Zalman Auerbach Zatzal that the candlesticks are an ornament to the house. And so Shlomo Zalman says, candlesticks, they make the house beautiful. So it's not like a knife of a shoichet, which you wouldn't use it for anything else. And therefore it's muksa gomer, muksa machmas chasarikis, a piece of musical and the violin, muksa machmas chasarikis, you wouldn't use it for anything else. But the candlesticks, he says, they are ornaments, and therefore they're not really muksa. And as a result, since the candlesticks are not muksa, he sees them like flowers or something, like a decoration for the house. And therefore, they're not real muksa. And as a result, you don't have to outbalance them. You only have to outbalance the flame. And so the challahs work for that. Amazing chiddush. I'm not going to, he takes that view. And so this is only negeya if you want to move the table. To use the table, that's not a problem. But if you want to move the table, so Shlomo Zalman comes up with this interesting chiddush. Now, most of us probably do not move our Shabbos table on Shabbos. It just states the question not so relevant. When it becomes more relevant is when it becomes Hanukkah, and you put your menorah on a little table, on a chair in the doorway, and in Hanukkah, in this part of the world, happens in winter time, and you want to, once the menorah is out, you want to close the door, so that shouldn't be drafty. You want to perhaps push the menorah to out of reach of toddlers. Menorah is expensive. So when you put something so you want to demuxify the table which has the menorah. So just putting down a mincha ma'ariv or a candy, that kind of thing doesn't really work because it's the menorah. If it's an expensive menorah, it's not outbalanced. Mincha ma'ariv has got very holy words, but I have about 200 mincha ma'arivs or whatever benches in my house, so it's not really a very valuable item. Therefore, it has to be something of similar value. So if you wanted to be able to move the menorah, some say that you should put down a piece of jewelry which is of similar value if you have such a jewelry. Even that, not everyone agrees, but fine. But that's where we're coming from. I want to address this. So you have a heter. Shlomo Zalman has a heter with the candlesticks. Possibly he would say the same thing with a silver menorah. It's a decoration, and therefore you wouldn't have to outbalance the value of the menorah, just the value of the flames, which is not a big deal. Uh, it can be something small also. Okay, let's move on to
Would
the
this
next.
would this be the same thing, the same issue with changing tablecloths? Would be like moving a table.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Sometimes also people want to put on a tray, they able to lift the tray. Same problem. Yeah, let's move on. Okay, so someone asked me about a room in your house which is rented out to a guy. So there's a difference when this is the poskim talk about if you got a goyish worker, a carer, is living in your house, or pair, whatever. So then that door has to have a mezuzah. You have children in your house, they're under bar mitzvah. Does that door need to have a mezuzah? Yes, because it's part of your dwelling. So the children who are under bar mitzvah, but their dwelling is part of your dwelling, therefore has to have a mezuzah. You have a larder, it's part of your dwelling. So if you have a servant who's a part of the functioning of the house, that room would need to have a mezuzah. Very interesting. But if you rent out a room to a goy, then this is a sefer called Mezuzahs Melochim, quoted in latest for him. He says that it does not need to have a mezuzah, and brings from the Das Kedoshim, from the Bachocha, who's not so sure about this. But generally, we take the view, it says in the Gemara, mezuzah choivas hadorhi. Mezuzah is the duty of the one who dwells there. And therefore, if the goy is living there, there's a contract, whether it's written or not, doesn't matter, but there's an agreement, he's a tenant there, then it does not need to have a mezuzah. Right. I'm going to go on to a question. Now, the Rebbe talks about this in the Sichos. In the words of our Chazal, very strong words about people who have faulty measures. So this Isha Tzidkonis went home and took her weights. They have this at the home. This is not for business. This is just for if they're making cooking stuff. So they have these weights, and she measured, and you could see. So the three smaller ones, they were accurate. The upper ones, the four upper ones, were all a few grams out. So now becomes the question, it says very strong words that you're not allowed to keep faulty weights. And it says you mustn't, let's say you've got a faulty measure, a bucket, which says a measure, and it's a faulty measure. So you mustn't even use it as a chamber pot. So what do I do with these weights in my house? May I keep them? They're not for trade. They are for when you make a recipe to work out the weights. So very interesting. So now this is from the Sefer Piskei Choshen, but it's a well-known halacha. You're not allowed to keep in possession a faulty measure, even if you're not using it for measures. And it says if you have such thing in your house or in your shop, the violation of a negative commandment, and even to use it as a chamber pot is also. So it's quite strong words. This woman had been learning a sikha of the Rebbe, where the Rebbe talks about it, very strong words about the issue of faulty measures. So that's the background to the question. So now the Piskei Choshen brings from the Kesef HaKadosh, also from Bachacharo, where he says if it is used at home just for measuring spices, for cooking, whatever. So he says, Efshesh after b'midas chasidus ein bozer. So the whole thing there is when you've got the measurements for trade, even though you're not using them, but it's easier to have them in your possession. But if they're not for the purpose of trade altogether, just for cooking at home, efshir, there's no issue, not even midas chassidus, because it's not used for trade. You're not going to be cheating anyone, and therefore that's okay. And he just leaves it with a tzarchiyun. It's not so confident. So I said to the lady, it is okay, but I would recommend that you take, let's say, with some sticky tape and stick on, I don't know, a penny or something, stick on something to even out the weight. It should actually match the weight which is written on the on that piece of weight. Someone's put here a question. If the weight is only off by a few grams, how would one know which is off? The weight just raw, the one you're measuring? Well, you've got a weighing scale, and hopefully that is accurate. Yeah, I guess that's the way. That's a good question, though. And yeah, and also, yeah, I said add something, and there's going to be slightly half a gram out. Also, how far do you have to go? They're good questions. I don't know. Right, let's move on. So now, is this I have no reference for, but a question: can you say a Misha Beirach for a non-Jew by the Torah? What I've seen of late is you have sometimes Bate Chabad, where it comes by the Misha Beirachs, and everyone has a chance to say the names of their dear ones, which is a beautiful way of involving people. And in particular, being Bate Chabad, I was recently, and each time some was saying a Goyish name. I thought perhaps as a Jew didn't have a Jewish name, but possibly it's like a non-Jew. Is it okay to do a mishabeach for a non-Jew at the Torah? I'll come back in a moment. I would like to say, since I'm talking about this, the time for the mishabeachs should be before maftir. And what I've seen in several places, they do it after maftir, and I can see the natural thing. You've finished Kriyas Torah, you've done Hagbah, oh no, now the time to do your mishabeachs. That's in the Gabba's mind. But in my mind, the between Kriyas HaTorah, between the Maftir and the Haftorah, one should actually avoid Hefsek as much as possible, because they are kind of a follow-on. The Haftorah is a follow-on from the Maftir. There's a whole discussion of the Rebbe, when the whole story when the Rebbe came out about saying Birchas HaGoimel before Kaddish, the objection to that. And the Rebbe talks about in Tov Reish Pei Zayin in 1927, when the Frierdiker Rebbe came out of prison. So then there's a whole discussion, when should the Rebbe bench Goimel? Because the Rebbe is Oile for Maftir. And then to say Hagoimel between Maftir and Haftorah is questionable. To say it earlier, the Rebbe gives three options. He doesn't say what they did. But so therefore, coming back to our point, that the time for the Mishabeirachs, and therefore what I'm saying, the natural gap in the Kriyas HaTorah should be actually before Maftir rather than after Maftir. But let's come back. So when Rabbi Telsner was the Rav in Finchley, one of his congregants, who was a fan of Chelsea, wanted to make a Mishaberach that Chelsea should win the match that afternoon. And so, for those who are overseas, Chelsea is the name of one of the football teams. Is it top? I don't know. So Rabbi Telner said that it's a Mishaberach by the Torah. Things which are shaykh to the Torah, you can give a Mishaberach. If it doesn't belong to the Torah, it doesn't not affiliated to the Torah, it doesn't belong here. We do give a bracha for the Melech with some shuls, yeah. It's in the Siddur. The Alter Rebbe also wrote it out, and we have it from the Alter Rebbe's handwriting. The bracha for the Melech is in many shuls is said, but that's not by the Torah. The Birchas HaMelech is it's after Yom Kippur, etc. It's not by the Torah, and so to say a bracha for a Nochri by the Torah, Misha Berach Avram Yitzchak Yaakov. which and of Shlomo, what's their connection there? You want to say a bracha for them? You can see, yeah, at a later in a different session. Later you can say brachas for them. I know I've had this before. Some shluchim have said that someone wanted to say a prayer for a not goyish girl who was going through a terrible illness, and they were very upset with the shliach haytochen. You don't care for the life of this young girl. It's not a question of not caring. It's just a question of where it belongs. That's all. Okay. Now let's go on. So point number 5 is a question about if you don't have a minyan for Shabbos davening, is it appropriate to take out a Sefer Torah or not, and do Kriyas HaTorah without brachas? So here you have on the screen, let's go step by step. We have here Siman Kuf Bem Gimel, where it starts up saying that Kriyas HaTorah needs to have a use of chumash. Sorry, not a chumash. It has to be a Sefer Torah which is rolled. And if it's just a chumash, you cannot use them for Kriyas HaTorah. And then the Mogen Avraham, the Ramos says Ein Levarich. It looks like you look in earlier sources, in some communities they would do Kriyas HaTorah with brachas on a chumash. They're talking about 700 years ago. It would be a handwritten chumash. But they would do Kriyas Torah, even if they didn't have a full Sefer Torah. They would make a Kriyas Torah or a Chumash also, and the poskim say, later poskim says, not okay. That's what the Ramah is saying, Ein Levarich. Mikol Mokim writes the Mogen Avraham, Koirin B'lei Bracha. Here's talking about a community which have, let's say, a minyan, but they don't have a Sefer Torah. So you can read from the Chumash without a bracha, and he adds Shaloi Tishtakach Toras Kriya. That this community should not fade away from them the idea that there's Kriyas Torah. They don't have a Sefer Torah, but do a substitute for Kriyas Torah, Shaloi Tishtakach. Mogen Avraham adds, Umash Mashan Chazan Koire Bekoil Rom Kamoi B'Shar Pa'omim. The impression is that from the Tanya Rabsi is that the Kriyas Torah from the Chumash without brachas is done in a way that the Baal Koire is reading aloud like a regular Kriyas Torah, but it's without the brachas. That is unlike what the Moker Chaim, which you have on the bottom of the screen. Moker Chaim is Reb Chaim Yoel Bachrach, otherwise known as the Chabas Yoyer, and he talks about Kol Yochid Koire. Each one individual is reading. Now, he was a contemporary of the Mogen Avraham. Mogen Avraham had actually the mazel that his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch became standard commentary in all Shulchan Aruchs, whereas the Chavas Yoris was laid in manuscript till about 50 years ago. At any rate, the Mogen Avraham is saying the impression is that you do a public reading, public as in limited it's a public reading, but for Chumash. On this, the Pri Megadim adds a different scenario. They're talking about you don't have the impediment is you don't have a Sefer Torah. What about if the impediment is you don't have a minyan? Possibly it's good to read without a bracha. Again, that the concept of Kriyas Torah shouldn't be forgotten. So now we have a recommendation. Right, so now coming back to our question. You don't have a minyan for your Shabbat services. Is it advisable to take out a Sefer Torah and read the week's Sedra? So this is, now the Pri Megadim doesn't necessarily talk about with the Chumash with the Sefer Torah. I personally don't see any difference. You're allowed to take out a Sefer Torah even without a minyan. The Arizal used to do Mav Sedra on Friday. Used to take out a Sefer Torah and do it with a Sefer Torah. It's not a problem. And so yes, you can take out a Sefer Torah and do that reading, but just bear in mind it's toiv likres. It's a recommendation. And many shluchim who are in a similar position will say when they don't have a minyan, what they will do is they'll sit around the table with those who are present, and they'll review the parsha around the table rather than with a formal Kriyas Torah, which may, in my mind, may be a more suited fulfillment, because if those people are not capable of following a chumash and hearing the whole Kriyas HaTorah read in Hebrew, then Kriya may be done better by sitting around and discussing the parsha. It depends on who your people are. If they are people who are fluent in Hebrew and can follow Kriyas HaTorah, then reading from the Sefer Torah, the whole lot, may be a better way of doing so. But if it's people who struggle with that, so talking about sitting around going through the parsha, not the whole parsha, but as much as you can, a reasonable amount, shaloi tishtachach, then that's you're fulfilling the tishtachach that way. So actually, I was at the house of my son in Wyoming when he had made a bris. It was a Shabbos Mevorach Nissen. We did not have a minyan. So I did it was a double sedra. I did a Kriyas HaTorah of the whole double sedra plus Parshas HaChodesh. Well, myself, my Mechutin was there, the Moil was there. There were a few Yidden who would appreciate at least a substitute for Kriyas HaTorah. People who are less fluid with Lashon HaKodesh, etc. Perhaps they would get more from an oral review or a discussion about the parsha. So that's really it's important to note. At Efsher Toivelik Christ, it's a recommendation, and you are allowed to modify, in my mind, accordingly. Now, the same group of interest are those small Bati Chabad without minyanim. And they could get minyanim, if they would ignore the fact that people are going to come by car, then it would be easy to get a minyan, or relatively easy, but that's they're there to promote Yiddishkeit, and you don't build Yiddishkeit by encouraging people to drive to your shul. So now the next question is, if I do take out a Sefer Torah, and this is also particularly relevant when coming up to Shavuos, and as there is a specific emphasis of doing Aseres HaDibros. So if you're going to not have a minyan, you'll do Aseres HaDibros. Do you do Vayhi ben Sayah Oren and Brich Shmei? And I said, yes, no problem. No problem. There's no brachal vatala, no problem there. What about Hashem Hashem on Yom Tov? So when we take out the Sefer Torah, somehow at some stage the Ashkenazic leadership deemed it fit to say Yud Gimel Mitzvah Rachamim, which is normally said in Slichas, to be said on Yom Tov. By the Sfardim, that doesn't exist, and the Sfardim are not, they're critical of it. But that's our minig, and it's in Alter Rebbe Siddur also. So it's an invocation of the Yugil Misarachamim, and you finish off, you say, it should be Es Rotzen, etc. Does that make sense to do so if you don't have a minyan? So I said no, because Yugil Misarachamim is meant to be said only with a minyan. That's how it says in Hilchos Tanis. What about saying it? It says in Hilchos Tanis, same place. It says, but you can say it kakoira b'Torah. You can say it with a trop kakoira b'Torah. So if you're saying Tachnun and you wanted to say Yud Gimel Rachamim because that's the flow, kakoira b'Torah, that's okay. You're saying Slichas. If you don't say if you want to say Yud Gimel Rachamim kakoira b'Torah, fine. Here I felt it's less in place, because here the whole exercise of saying Yud Gimel Rachamim is because of Bakashas Rachamim. I know it's always that's the purpose, but there it's within a framework of other tefillas. Here it's a dedicated moment. We're going to say Yugil Rachamim, this inyan of Yugil Rachamim. If it's Kakoyer Batoyer, so then what's the point of doing it? Fine. Those are my thoughts about this. Now, following on from that, what about Birchas Koyanim? Can you do Birchas Koyanim without a minyan, without a bracha? Can the Kohen stand up there and give Birchas Koyanim? Okay, so here we have a Mishnah where it says Payus al Shema, which means Baruch Hu, and Oyrim V'Ateu, which means Ahoich Kedusha, Ve'ein Noislis Kapeim, and that's Birchas Koyanim, Ve'ein Koyim Kriyas HaTorah, Haftorah, and all of these you cannot do it b'pochos mi'asar. You cannot fulfill these in Yonim without 10 people, and therefore to do Birchas Koyanim without 10 people is, it says the Mishnah that you can't do it. So what we're going to do a Shaloi Tishtachach. It's interesting. Can we do el shaloi tishtachach Torah's birchas kohanim? Don't know. It's a big chiddush, yeah? Because why is it big chiddush? Possibly it's doing birchas kohanim. It's a mitzvah with birchas mitzvahs. I don't know. It feels, and also in what context? How are you going to do birchas kohanim without Chazar Sashatz? Birchas kohanim was parked by Chazal, going to be part of Chazar Sashatz. If you don't have a minion, don't do Chazar Sashatz. So what? Just do birchas kohanim on its own. If a kohen wants to stand up and give brachas without, just say that Yorechacha, you can do so. But the whole performance of as we have with under the talis and all that kind of stuff with the Ribono Shel Olam, I feel that's without a minion. I don't think that's appropriate. Right, let's move on. And so the next question, which I have, number 8, is also from this same group of people, of shluchim. If they Friday evening, sorry, making a Kabbalah Shabbos service on Zoom and before the Hadlokas Neiros. I said, don't call it Friday night service. Call it perhaps welcoming of Shabbos. Now, in the days of COVID, a lot of shluchim were doing this, having an online Kabbalah, a pre-Kabbalah Shabbos thing. At first, my first response was actually that the Arizal, when he went out to the fields, it was also not a Kabbalah Shabbos as such, but I checked it up again yesterday, and I was slightly. It does say he would go out to the fields and do his Kabbalah Shabbos looking to the west, looking where the sun is setting. And that's where it comes back, where I'm looking to the back of the shul, which is usually the west. And then he came back, and then he put on his talus, so it's Forshkia, and then he went and looked at the table where the candles are lit, and he went around the table, some kind of hakofa, but it doesn't say he did malachas. I was totally accurate in that. So if it's clear, both during the session and the way it's advertised, that it's not a Kabbalah Shabbos, it's a pre-Shabbos service, then it might be a nice thing that people are clicking, joining in, and they are encouraged. Perhaps it will encourage them more to light candles as they should in the right time, etc. It could be a nice thing, but let's have to assess it carefully. Right, let's go on to point number 8. So someone sent me the cover of a box of crackers with a good hechsher, and if you can see where the arrows point to, Mechose mezoinus kemach yoshon, that the bracha on these crackers is mezoinus. And you look on the ingredients, they are just made of flour and water. So why are these crackers mezoinus? This is the question. And so you got these small matzahs, the crackers, are they mezoinus or hamoitzi? So we look in Shulchan Aruch, there's an Alter Rebbe, and before, we have a term, we've got 3 types of mezoinus, and one of the 3 categories mentioned in the Gemara is pas habo bekisnin. And the term pas habo bekisnin has got 3 pirushim, brought in Shulchan Aruch and the Alter Rebbe too, in Siman Kuf Samach. One is pas habo bekisnin meloshen of nibbling. It's a bread which is nibbled because it's flavored with fruit juice, it's flavored with eggs. It's something which is not a regular bread, it's a flavored bread. And that makes it mezoinus. I was talking in class today. What's the difference between a snack and a meal? What about mezoinus bread, etc.? A snack is typically highly flavored, and it's meant to give you a boost of energy and it works for the short term, for the next half hour. A meal is dafka, you don't have highly flavored bread. The carbs are going to be less strongly flavored, and you'll be able to have therefore more of them, more of the carbs, and it will last you not just a half an hour, it lasts you 3-4 hours, give you your fill for the next few hours. That's a meal. So this is the first opinion, Pastor Baba Kisnin, a flavored pastry. Because of its flavoring, it is people nibble small amounts of it at a time, therefore it's mezainis. The second opinion is Pastor Kisnin. Meloshin Kis is a pouch. It's a pouch filled with sweet stuff. So it's with like a strudel or whatever, which is filled with raisins or with apples or with whatever it may be, a sweet stuff. Now the Alter Rebbe does take issue that if it's filled with things like meat or cheese or fish, that's not enough to make it resonance. Now, don't get carried away with things like knishes, etc. Usually, the pastry there is made with shortening with margarine, and that's why it's resonance, the pastry itself. But if it were just a flour and water pastry and filled with meat or filled with minced meat or with and baked that way, according to the Alter Rebbe, it's still hamoitzi because it's normal to have meat with your bread. Therefore, it doesn't take it away from a meal thing. But if it's filled with sweet stuff, again, it's something which you would only have as a snack. Then the main thing which is relevant to our discussion is the third apirish, which is Rav Hai Gaon. Yes, Meforshim, that Pasabah Bekisnin, it's actually made with water, and it's not flavored, and it's not filled, but it is ugois yeveshos. They are dry, and he calls them kichlach, and they in the Arabic word was kachin dakin. That's the lashon of Rav Hai Gaon. Thin crackers. Thin crackers are mezainis, according to Rav Hai Gaon. Now, the thing is that you look in the Alter Rebbe Seder Birchas HaNe'enin, and he doesn't mention this third opinion. And so therefore someone had come to the conclusion, the Alter Rebbe doesn't pass like Rav Hai Gaon, which I find very difficult to accept. If everyone accepts Rav Hai Gaon, in other words, that all three interpretations of Pasuk Babakistan are legitimate, and you can rely on each one of them. So why does the Alter Rebbe not bring Rav Hai Gaon in the Be'ased V'chasnanin? Very simple. It comes Pesach, and the very thing which Rav Hai Gaon says is it's ugois yeveshos and these thin crackers. That's what we eat on Pesach. According to Rav Hai Gaon, that's Mazonis. So the Sfardim indeed differentiate on a whole year round. The matzah is Mazonis. It comes to Pesach, it becomes Hamotzi. The Ashkenazim don't follow that solution. So the matzah is you have it for a meal. On Pesach, it's the meal. How can you say it's just a snack food? Since if it's Pesach a meal, it's a whole year meal. So therefore, the Alter Rebbe doesn't bring Rav Hai Gaon because of the change of our lifestyle of with what we have on Pesach, and therefore he had to be quiet on Rav Hai Gaon. But what would happen if something like pretzels? I'm talking about hard pretzels, flour and water. But no one is Kaveh Suda on pretzels. It's a snack food. I'm not reminding even with salty, not salty. It's a thing which is it's clearly not a meal. It's clearly a snack. Then you could say mezainis because they will rely on Rav Hai Gaon. It's made flour and water, but it's a snack food. And therefore, coming back to these crackers. Now, this is where this Hersher is giving is saying bechosim mezainis because it's a cracker, like Rav Hai Gaon. Where I have the dilemma is where do I draw the line? So a 5-inch square matzah is hamotzi. What if it's a 3-inch square or 2-inch square? Where do I draw the line? When is this a hamotzi matzah, or when is it becoming a snack food and therefore is mezoinus? That I don't have an answer. But if it's clearly a snack food, then it is legitimate to say that it's mezoinus. Let's move on. So a few weeks ago, I was speaking about potato kugel, and I'd said how Rabbi Zalman Shimon once showed me in the Siddur of Yaakov Emden, where he says that the bracha on grated potato kugel is shahakol, I guess because it's changed in its form. Just to remind you what I'd said at the time, that list of foods in an alphabetical order is not from Rabbi Yaakov Emden himself. It's not in the original Siddur which he printed in his lifetime in Tov Kuf Hey. It was added by a later printer. But all right, it's someone of some degree of authority put that list together. So this fellow writes to me that when he was in Kailul in 1973, Robert Dworkin he used to actually sit in the kollel every day, and he differentiated how you made the potato kugel. If you use a grater or if you used a blender. If you'd used a blender, then he'd say, yes, that's what they're talking about, it becomes shahakel. But if it's a grater was used, then it retains the broch of Adon, which is useful. You can still see the degree of form of the original potato in shreds. So that's useful to know. Um,
Who is this?
Again, someone by the name of David Waxer, who lives in Frankfurt, who listens to the Shia, I guess, to the recording, he wrote to me that when he was in Kailul in 1973, so in 770, Kailul, so Rav Dworkin told him that the question of whether a potato kugel is hadom or shahakal depends on how it was prepared. If the potatoes went through a blender, which means that we're more like pureed, then it would be shahakal. If they went through a grater, which means that the shreds are more recognizable, then it remains hadom. Okay, good to know. So now almost finished our list for today. And someone asked me yesterday about softening hardened honey. So if you take honey, which is runny to a degree, if you want to ruin it, put it in the fridge. Yeah, then it becomes hard, and then it's a whole headache to get it soft again. He's asking whether you can add hot water to the honey on Shabbos, and that way it becomes more usable. So at first I said to take a chunk of honey and put it into a cup of tea. We do that with sugar. That's okay. So, but then he says no, he wants to pour the hot water into the honey. And for that matter, it would be the similar question. How about taking that jar of honey and put it into a tub which has got hot water? You're taken from the blech and you put into a klisheni, one to klishlishi, got a tub with hot water, and you want to put the jar of honey into the hot water, and it should then ease the hardening and should be able to be usable. Are you allowed to do that on Shabbos? So that I was really not so keen, and I was actually correct in my hesitation because there is a din of moilit. We're not allowed to take a solid and make it into a liquid on Shabbos. Um, so this is from Piskei Teshuvos in the end, towards the end of Siman Shin Yud Ches, which is a din about cooking, where he talks about nothing to do with bishul. It's not because of heat. It can be klisheni, klishlishi, but to take a solid and make it into a liquid, that's a problem on Shabbos of moilit, of creating a new thing. Now interesting that he has here, particularly he mentions dvash specifically as amongst other foods. Let's say to melt chocolate without boiling hot, just to melt it, etc. So these would all come into the same thing of taking a solid and making it into a liquid is not okay. Now, I had thoughts that Reb Shlomo Zalman has got a certain heter, and he says if it doesn't change its. He says like this: when it was water, sorry, when it was ice and you make water, it's a different materials. But when it was milk, and when it was frozen was milk, and when it's defrosted it's milk. So you haven't changed its status. It's still got the same name. So Shlomo Zalman is noitel lahokel on that. So helpfully, the Piskei Teshuvos is a contemporary. He gives a reference to Rav Forkash's Sefer Shabbos Kahalocha, who really is not happy with the psak of Reb Shlomo Zalman on this, and he brings some degree of proofs to say that even though it's something which it not change its title, still to make it dissolve or to melt, to become from a solid into a liquid, still remains a bracha. So still remains a problem to do so on Shabbos. So my answer to this question about softening hardened honey by heat or etc., that would not be okay because of moilid and etc. He gives another couple of definitions over there. All right, I'm going to finish off with the Siyum Harambam because we're just today finishing Sefer Noshim and beginning Sefer Kedusha, and so I'm going to read the last halacha. It's very interesting that we're learning Gemara Sota because it's Sfir Sa'omer, and then we're also learning the end of Hilchas of Sefer Noshim in Rambam as Hilchas Sota and talks about the union of kinui, where a man would tell his wife, I don't want to see you alone with so and so and so. And the Rambam finishes off about not to rush into this kind of kinui in the presence of Adim, rather to speak in a calm way, in a way of concern, and to guide your family in the right way and not to get into trouble. And he says that one who doesn't take steps to look after his family and to keep them to the straight and narrow, so to speak, so then that's sinful, as it says, ki v'yodato ki sholem ohalecha. You should be aware that your tent is at peace. Fokadato novcho. You should remember your house v'lo sechato, and you shouldn't sin. And if that's the end of the Berich Rachmona de Sion. So I picked up when I was in New York. I picked up this Sefer two-volume set called Oitzer Hamelech, and this is all the Biurim of the Rebbe on Rambam. So there has been an earlier work called Yein Malchus. Yein Malchus was from the several years after the launch of Limud HaRambam. So there's those sichas, but there are many, many more biurim of the Rebbe beyond the Yein Malchus, and that's what will be done here by Rabbi Lipsker of Sherman Oaks. I'm sure other people helped him to collate all the comments of the Rebbe on the Rambam, the Mishnah Torah. And so here I'm just to pick up on one word of the Rebbe. Now, very interesting that the Rebbe was particularly concerned on Messiah B'Toiv. It was one of the things which the Rebbe was well known when the Rebbe's Haggadah, when the relaunch of the Haggadah overhaul in Tovshin Lamed Gimel. So the Rebbe's Haggadah had been printed 4 times before then, or 5 times perhaps. And here they put together a new layout and with the sichas at the back. And the last sicha finished off on a negative point. And when the Rebbe saw the Sefer, of course, he was happy with the Sefer. He was not happy with the fact that it finished off on a negative note. And he gave an instruction they should get a rubber stamp and of Lashon Haba Yerushalayim, I believe. And so a few stamps were made, rubber stamps, and Bochrim were standing there in 770 stamping thousands for him or more with those 3 words of Lashon Haba Yerushalayim. So this is something which the Rebbe was particular about. Also, when it came the Siyum HaShas Yerushalmi, and the Reb Pinchas Menachem, who later became Ger Rebbe, he had been by the Rebbe, and the Rebbe recommended how to finish. The end of Gemara Nida in Yerushalmi apparently is not on a positive note, and the Rebbe recommended that they should also include in the shir of the Shas Talmud Yerushalmi also the Mishnayos of the last Prokim, and that way it also finish off B'Dover Tov. And there's a whole story about that. So the Rebbe is very concerned about L'Sayim B'Dover Tov. So now, how do we deal with this end of the Rambam with these words? So the Rebbe makes the following comment. When we say Messiah B'Tov, it can mean the last word is good or the content is good. And therefore, Sefer Noshim, although it finishes off with the word techto, but it actually says v'lo sechto. In other words, it's saying take precautions, and in that way, v'lo sechto, there won't be sin. So that is considered a siyum b'dover tov. That's considered completing on a good note. I'm going to just finish off and say that we finish from Rambam Sefer Kedusha, we start Sefer Noshim, we start Sefer Kedusha. The Rambam has every Sefer starts with a posuk. And I'm not going to go into this now, but I have noticed between different editions of the Rambam, not always do they have the same posuk as the opener for the Sifrei Harambam, and we'll leave that for another occasion. Meanwhile, I wish you all a good night and a good Shabbos, and we should hear Besuras Tevis, Besuras Hagulov, Sechazeno Einenu, Beshuvcho, L'Tzion Berachmim, Umalcheinu Berashenu. All
Go ahead. Thank you.
Sure.